The church bells had not even finished ringing when Evelyn Hart felt the folded paper pressed into her gloved hand. She looked down at it, confused, still smiling from the vows she had just spoken. The Duke standing beside her, tall and unreadable, did not smile back. His eyes were fixed forward, toward the doors of the chapel, as if the woman he had just married were no more than a formality, to be completed before the real business of his life could continue. "Read it tonight," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. Not before. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the paper. Around them, the guests were rising, clapping, murmuring their congratulations, but she barely heard any of it. She had known this marriage was arranged. She had known there would be no love in it, not at first, not for a man like Alexander Ashford, the Duke of Ravensworth, a man whose name alone made grown men lower their voices in respect and fear. She had prepared herself for coldness. She had prepared herself for distance. She had not prepared herself for a list of rules handed to her like a contract at the very moment she became his wife. The carriage ride to Ravensworth Hall was silent. Evelyn sat across from him, her hands folded over the paper in her lap, resisting the urge to unfold it right there in the dim light of the carriage. She studied him instead. He looked out the window, his jaw set, his posture perfectly straight, a man carved from marble rather than flesh. She had heard the stories about him long before she ever met him. They said his father had been cruel, that his mother had died when he was young, that the Duke himself had never once been seen showing affection to another living soul. She had thought, foolishly, that perhaps those stories were exaggerated. Now, sitting 3 feet away from him in a carriage on their wedding night, she was no longer sure. "You do not have to pretend to be pleased," he said suddenly, without turning his head. Evelyn blinked. "Pleased about what, Your Grace?" "About this. About me." He finally looked at her, and for a moment she saw something flicker behind his gray eyes, something that might have been exhaustion, or perhaps regret. "I know why your father agreed to this marriage. I know why you agreed to it. Debts do not disappear because 2 people stand before a priest and say pretty words." "No," Evelyn said carefully, "they do not." "Then let us not waste time pretending this is anything other than what it is." He turned back to the window. "You will find the rules I have given you are not cruel. They are simply practical. Follow them, and our lives will be comfortable. Break them, and you will find me very difficult to live with." Evelyn said nothing. She had already decided, somewhere between the altar and the carriage, that she would not be a woman who lived quietly inside someone else's rules. She had spent her whole life doing what was expected of her, marrying a stranger to save her family from ruin being only the latest example. But there was a difference between accepting a marriage and accepting a cage, and she intended to discover, before the night was over, exactly which one this was. Ravensworth Hall rose out of the darkness, like something built to intimidate rather than welcome. Its stone towers stretched high into the night sky, and its windows, most of them dark, watched her arrival like 100 unblinking eyes. A row of servants stood outside despite the late hour, bowing as the carriage came to a stop. Evelyn noticed how quickly they moved, how carefully they avoided looking directly at the Duke, as though even his silence carried weight enough to bruise. An older woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight knot, stepped forward, and introduced herself as Margaret, the head housekeeper. Her eyes were kind, but cautious, the eyes of someone who had learned, over many years, exactly how much warmth was safe to show in this house. "Your chambers are ready, Your Grace," Margaret said to Evelyn, then hesitated, glancing briefly at the Duke before adding, "I hope you will find everything to your liking." "Thank you, Margaret," Evelyn said, offering a smile the housekeeper did not seem to expect. The Duke said nothing further. He simply turned and walked toward the east side of the house, his boots echoing against the stone floor, disappearing through a heavy door, without so much as a glance back at his new wife. Evelyn stood alone in the entrance hall, the folded paper still clutched in her hand, and felt, for the first time since the wedding, a flicker of anger beneath the fear. Margaret led her up a wide staircase and down a long corridor lined with paintings of stern-faced men and women who Evelyn assumed were ancestors of the Ashford family. None of them smiled. None of them looked particularly happy to have their portraits painted. It seemed a fitting welcome to a house that clearly valued duty over warmth. Her chambers, when she finally reached them, were beautiful in a cold sort of way. Tall windows overlooked dark gardens below. A fireplace crackled softly, already lit, casting a warm orange glow across furniture that looked as though it had never truly been used. Everything was in its place. Nothing looked lived in. Once Margaret had left her alone, promising to send a maid in the morning, Evelyn finally allowed herself to sit by the fire and unfold the paper the Duke had given her. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost mechanical. Rule 1. Do not seek my company unless invited. Rule 2. Do not enter the east wing of the house under any circumstance. Rule 3. Do not involve yourself in matters concerning the estate or its tenants. Rule 4. Do not ask questions about my family or my past. Rule 5. Do not expect affection where none has been promised. Evelyn read the list twice, her stomach tightening with each line. She had expected coldness. She had not expected a document that read more like the terms of a business arrangement than the beginning of a marriage. And yet, as she sat there in the flickering firelight, something in her refused to feel only fear. A quiet, stubborn anger began to rise instead, warm and steady beneath her ribs. She thought of her mother, years ago, telling her that a woman's worth was measured by how well she could endure silence. She thought of her father, signing away her future to settle debts he had created through his own carelessness. She thought of every moment in her life when she had been told to be smaller, quieter, more agreeable, and she felt something inside her harden with quiet resolve. If the Duke believed a list of rules could turn her into a woman who disappeared quietly into the corners of his house, he did not yet understand who he had married. The next morning, Evelyn woke before the sun had fully risen. She dressed herself, refusing the help of the maid who knocked timidly at her door, and walked to the small writing desk near the window. There, she took the folded list of rules, smoothed it carefully across the wood, and used a small silver frame she found among the room's decorations to display it. Not hidden away in a drawer, but hung directly on the wall where she would see it every single morning. It was not obedience. It was a reminder, a declaration she made only to herself, that she had read his rules, understood them completely, and intended to break every single one of them, not out of foolishness, but because she refused to spend the rest of her life shrinking to fit inside someone else's fear. She dressed for breakfast, straightened her shoulders, and walked down the long corridor toward the dining hall, already knowing that the first rule would not survive the morning. The dining hall was massive, far too large for 2 people, with a table long enough to seat 20 guests comfortably. The Duke sat at the far end, a cup of tea in front of him, a stack of papers beside his plate, entirely absorbed in whatever he was reading. He did not look up when Evelyn entered. She had been told, quite clearly, not to seek his company unless invited. She had also decided, quite clearly, that this was a rule she did not intend to follow. Evelyn walked the length of the table and sat down in the chair closest to him, rather than at the distant seat clearly meant for her. The Duke's eyes flicked up briefly, surprise flashing across his face before it disappeared behind his usual composed expression. "Good morning," she said, pouring herself tea as though nothing unusual had happened. "You were not invited to sit here," he said, his voice flat. "No," Evelyn agreed pleasantly. "I invited myself." For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as if trying to determine whether she was foolish or simply defiant. Evelyn met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first, refusing to let the discomfort in her chest show on her face. "You read the rules," he said finally. "I did," Evelyn replied, "and I framed them, so I would never forget a single word." Something shifted in his expression, something Evelyn could not quite name, not quite anger, not quite amusement. Something caught between the two, uncertain of which direction to fall. "You are supposed to follow them," he said, "not decorate your wall with them." "I am your wife," Evelyn said simply, setting down her teacup, "not your prisoner. There is a difference, Your Grace, and I intend for you to learn it." The silence that followed stretched long enough that a servant near the door shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. The Duke's jaw tightened, his fingers pausing over the papers in front of him, and for just a moment, Evelyn thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle her more than his coldness ever had. "You will regret this," he said quietly, though there was less certainty in his voice than there had been the night before. "Perhaps," Evelyn said, lifting her tea again. But I have never been a woman who lived comfortably behind rules I did not choose myself. You will simply have to grow accustomed to that, Your Grace, the same way I intend to grow accustomed to living in this very large, very cold house." He did not respond. He simply returned his attention to his papers, though Evelyn noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that his eyes no longer moved across the page the way they had before she arrived. Breakfast continued in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than the one from the carriage the night before. It was not empty. It was charged, tense, filled with two people quietly measuring each other, each wondering how much the other was willing to endure. When breakfast ended, the Duke rose from the table without a word and walked toward his study, his usual retreat. The place Evelyn already understood was meant to be untouched by her presence. She watched him go, then glanced toward Margaret, who was hovering near the doorway with poorly concealed curiosity. "Is he always like this?" Evelyn asked quietly. Margaret hesitated, clearly unsure how much she was permitted to say. "He has not always been so guarded, my lady. Not before certain things happened in this house." She paused, glancing toward the direction of the east wing, then quickly changed the subject, promising instead to show Evelyn the gardens if she wished for fresh air. Evelyn agreed, though her mind lingered on Margaret's words long after they had left the dining hall. Certain things happened in this house. She thought of the second rule on the list, the one forbidding her from entering the east wing, and felt a curiosity begin to stir inside her that she knew, without question, she would not be able to resist for long. That evening, alone again in her chambers, Evelyn stood before the framed list on her wall and studied it carefully, rule by rule. She had already broken the first one, walking uninvited into his presence, and she intended, before this marriage grew any older, to break every single one that remained. Not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because she had begun to suspect, watching the flicker of something unreadable behind the Duke's eyes at breakfast, that the man who wrote those rules was not protecting his house from her. He was protecting himself from something far older and far more painful, something buried deep within those locked doors of the East Wing, something Evelyn intended to uncover no matter how many rules stood in her way. She traced her finger along the frame, feeling the cool glass beneath her fingertips, and allowed herself, for the first time since her wedding, a small and determined smile. Tomorrow, she decided, she would break the second rule. The east wing of Ravensworth Hall stood behind a set of heavy oak doors at the end of a corridor Evelyn had never dared to walk before that morning. The hinges groaned softly as she pushed one door open, the sound echoing through empty air that smelled faintly of dust and old lavender. Sunlight filtered weakly through curtained windows, illuminating furniture draped in white cloth, as though the entire wing had been prepared for a funeral that had never quite ended. Evelyn stepped inside carefully, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She had told no one where she was going, not even Margaret, who had gone into town that morning to purchase supplies for the household. The Duke, she knew, was occupied with tenants on the far side of the estate and would not return until late afternoon. It was, she had calculated, the safest possible time to break the second rule on his list. The room she entered first appeared to be a sitting room, though clearly untouched for years. A writing desk sat near the window, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust, and above it hung a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, so strikingly similar to the Duke's own features that Evelyn immediately understood who she was looking at. His mother. Evelyn moved closer, studying the portrait carefully. The woman in the painting looked nothing like the stern, cold figures hanging in the main corridors of the house. She looked warm, almost mischievous, her lips curved in a soft smile that seemed to promise laughter rather than judgment. It was strange, Evelyn thought, how a house could hold two such different kinds of portraits, as though it had been built by people who could not decide whether warmth was something to celebrate or something to hide away. She opened one of the desk drawers gently, half expecting it to be locked, but it slid open with ease. Inside she found letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbon. She hesitated only a moment before untying the bundle and reading the top letter, her curiosity now far too strong to resist. The letter was written in the same handwriting as the woman's portrait suggested, addressed to a young boy named Alexander, filled with small affections, memories of walks through the garden, promises to teach him how to fish in the summer, reminders that he was loved even on days when his father's temper filled the house with silence instead of warmth. Evelyn's chest tightened as she read further, understanding, piece by piece, the kind of childhood the Duke must have endured. A door creaked somewhere behind her, and Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. She turned quickly, expecting to see the Duke himself, filled with fury at finding her exactly where he had forbidden her to be. Instead, she found only an empty corridor, the sound likely nothing more than the old house settling under its own weight. Still, her hands trembled slightly, as she carefully retied the ribbon around the letters, and placed them back inside the drawer, exactly as she had found them. She continued through the wing slowly, discovering a nursery further down the hall, small and untouched, a wooden rocking horse standing silently in the corner, beside a child's bed still made up with faded blue sheets. It was clear no one had entered this room in years, perhaps decades, preserved like a memory too painful to disturb, and too precious to erase completely. It was in this room that the Duke found her. Evelyn heard his footsteps first, sharp and quick against the wooden floor, and turned, just as he appeared in the doorway, his face pale with something far more complicated than simple anger. His eyes moved from her face to the rocking horse beside her, then back again, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all. "I told you never to come here," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "I am sorry for disobeying you, but I am not sorry for what I found." His jaw tightened. "You had no right." "Perhaps not," Evelyn agreed, stepping carefully away from the rocking horse. "But I am your wife, and I do not believe a marriage can survive built entirely on secrets I am forbidden to ask about." "This has nothing to do with you," he said, though his voice cracked slightly on the final word, betraying an emotion he clearly wished to hide. Evelyn took a slow breath, choosing her next words carefully. "I read one of your mother's letters. I did not mean to intrude so deeply, but once I began, I could not stop myself." She watched his expression carefully, waiting for the explosion of anger she feared might follow. Instead, something in him seemed to collapse quietly inward, as though the fight had suddenly drained out of him. "She died when I was 7, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father closed this wing the same week. He said, grief served no purpose in a house meant to run efficiently." He laughed once, bitter and humorless. He was very good at making sure nothing here ever felt too much like a home. Evelyn's heart ached at the quiet pain in his voice, a pain he had clearly spent his entire life trying to bury beneath rules and cold formality. "I am sorry," she said softly, "truly." "I do not want your pity," he said quickly, though there was less bite in his words than before. "It is not pity," Evelyn said. "It is understanding. There is a difference, though I suspect you have not been given many reasons in your life to learn it." He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face, as though trying to determine whether she meant what she said, or was simply attempting to disarm him. Whatever he found there seemed to soften something in his expression, though he quickly turned away, clearing his throat as if to reset the moment entirely. "You should not have come here," he repeated, though his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "No," Evelyn agreed, "but I am glad that I did." He did not respond to that. Instead, he walked slowly toward the nursery window, staring out at the gardens below, his shoulders tense beneath his coat. Evelyn remained where she stood, giving him the space he clearly needed, though she found herself unable to look away from him, this man who had seemed so impossibly cold only a day before, now standing quietly broken in the very room that held the memory of the childhood he had lost. "My father believed emotion was a weakness," he said eventually, still facing the window. "He taught me that affection only left room for pain later. I believed him, for a very long time." "And now?" Evelyn asked softly. He turned to face her, his expression guarded but no longer entirely closed. "Now I am no longer certain what I believe." The words hung between them, fragile and unfinished, and Evelyn felt something shift quietly in her chest, a small crack forming in the wall she had expected to remain permanently sealed between them. She did not push him further. She simply nodded, offering him a small, understanding smile, before turning to leave the room, allowing him the privacy he clearly needed, with the memories she had unknowingly disturbed. "Evelyn," he said suddenly, before she reached the door, She turned back, surprised to hear him use her name for the first time since their wedding. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not asking more than I could answer." Evelyn nodded once, then left the East Wing without another word, her mind spinning with everything she had learned, everything she had seen, and everything she still did not understand about the man she had married. She walked back toward her own chambers slowly, pausing near the framed list of rules still hanging on her wall. Rule 2, forbidding her from entering the East Wing, was now officially broken. She studied the remaining rules carefully, wondering which one she would challenge next, wondering how many more locked doors stood between herself and the man hidden behind Ravensworth Hall's cold reputation. She had expected, when she agreed to this marriage, nothing more than a life of quiet endurance beside a stranger. She had not expected to feel, so quickly and so unexpectedly, a pull toward uncovering every secret this house and this man had spent years trying to bury. That night, as she lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, Evelyn realized something had changed inside her since stepping into that nursery. She no longer saw the Duke as simply a cold, unreachable figure standing between her and a comfortable life. She saw a boy who had lost his mother too young, raised by a father who mistook coldness for strength, taught from childhood that love was a danger rather than a gift. She did not yet know if she could break through walls built over so many years, but she knew, with growing certainty, that she intended to try. News arrived at Ravensworth Hall 3 days later, carried by a breathless messenger who had ridden hard from the city. Evelyn was in the small library reading when Margaret found her, her face unusually pale, a folded letter clutched tightly in her hands. "His Grace requests your presence in the study," Margaret said. "Immediately, my lady." Evelyn set down her book and followed Margaret through the corridors, her mind racing through possibilities. The Duke had never once summoned her to his study since their wedding. Whatever had happened, it was serious enough to break his own carefully maintained distance. She found him standing behind his desk, a letter spread open in front of him, his expression darker than she had ever seen it. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw something close to genuine worry behind his composed exterior. "Lord Whitmore has accused my family of manipulating tenant contracts across 3 counties," he said without preamble. "He intends to bring the matter before the council within the week, and if his claims gain support, it could cost us not only our reputation, but control of nearly half our estate." Evelyn stepped closer, reading the letter he gestured toward. The accusations were serious, detailed, clearly crafted by someone who understood exactly how to damage a family's standing, without ever needing to prove a single claim in a court of law. "Is any of it true?" she asked carefully. "No," the Duke said firmly, "but truth rarely matters once accusations reach the right ears. Then we must ensure the right ears hear the truth, before they hear his version of events," Evelyn said, already thinking quickly through the problem in front of her. He glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features. "This does not concern you." "It concerns this house," Evelyn replied evenly, "and I live in this house. Whether you intended it or not, Your Grace, that makes it concern me as well." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to reconsider, perhaps remembering how thoroughly she had already ignored his previous objections. Instead, he exhaled slowly and gestured for her to sit. "Lord Whitmore has always resented my family's influence," he explained. "His own estate borders ours, and he has long believed certain lands rightfully belong to him, lands my grandfather purchased fairly, though Whitmore has never accepted that fact. This accusation is simply his latest attempt to weaken our position through public embarrassment, rather than legal means." "Then we expose his motive," Evelyn said. "If the council understands this accusation stems from old resentment, rather than genuine concern for the tenants, his claims will collapse under their own weight. And how do you propose we prove his motive?" the Duke asked, though there was less skepticism in his voice than before. Evelyn thought for a moment. "There is a ball being held at Lady Pemberton's estate this weekend, is there not? Half the council members who will decide this matter will be present." "There is," he confirmed slowly, watching her with growing curiosity. "Then we attend," Evelyn said, "together, and we ensure, quietly and carefully, that the right people understand exactly what kind of man Lord Whitmore truly is, without ever appearing as though we are attempting to defend ourselves too eagerly. Nothing invites suspicion faster than desperation." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his gray eyes that Evelyn could not quite name. "You have clearly thought about matters of society and influence, far more carefully than I expected." "I grew up watching my father lose everything through carelessness," Evelyn said quietly. "I learned quickly how easily reputation can be destroyed, and how carefully it must be protected." He nodded slowly. Then, after a pause that stretched long enough to feel significant, said, "Very well. We attend together." The following days passed in careful preparation. Evelyn found herself, for the first time since arriving at Ravensworth Hall, working alongside the Duke rather than existing quietly beside him. They reviewed tenant records together late into the evening, identifying details that would clearly disprove Whitmore's claims. She discovered, during these long hours, a version of the Duke she had not expected to find, sharp and thoughtful, occasionally revealing a dry humor that surprised a laugh out of her more than once. "You did not strike me as a man capable of jokes," she said one evening, after he had made a particularly dry comment about Lord Whitmore's questionable taste in waistcoats. "I did not strike myself as such a man either," he admitted, glancing at her with something almost like warmth. "It appears marriage has revealed several things about myself I did not previously know existed." Evelyn smiled at that, feeling something warm bloom quietly in her chest, something she quickly reminded herself not to trust too completely. Rules had been broken between them, walls had begun to crack, but she was careful not to mistake progress for certainty. Men like the Duke, raised the way he had been raised, did not change entirely in a matter of days. The night of Lady Pemberton's ball arrived quickly. Evelyn dressed carefully, choosing a deep blue gown that Margaret assured her complemented her coloring beautifully, and made her way down to meet the Duke in the entrance hall. He turned as she approached, and for a brief moment, his composed expression faltered entirely, something unmistakably admiring flashing across his face before he quickly regained his usual control. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thank you, Your Grace," Evelyn replied, feeling a small thrill at the sincerity in his voice. The ball itself was a whirlwind of careful conversation and quiet strategy. Evelyn moved through the crowded room at the Duke's side, engaging council members in seemingly casual conversation, guiding discussions gently toward Lord Whitmore's long-standing resentment over the disputed lands. She watched, with quiet satisfaction, as understanding slowly dawned across several important faces throughout the evening. Lord Whitmore himself arrived late, clearly unaware of the groundwork already laid against his accusations. He approached the Duke directly, his expression smug and confident. "I trust you received my letter, Ashford," he said, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "I did," the Duke replied calmly, as did several members of the council, who seemed quite interested in discussing the history of the lands in question, including the original purchase agreements your own grandfather witnessed and signed. Whitmore's confident expression faltered slightly. "That matter was settled decades ago." "Then I am certain you will have no objection to it being reviewed publicly," Evelyn said smoothly, stepping forward with a polite smile. "Given how strongly you seem to care about protecting the tenants' rights, I imagine you would welcome the transparency." Whitmore's eyes narrowed, clearly recognizing he had been outmaneuvered, though he could hardly object without confirming exactly the motives Evelyn and the Duke had spent the evening quietly exposing. He excused himself shortly afterward, his earlier confidence considerably diminished. Later that evening, standing together near a quiet balcony overlooking the gardens, the Duke turned to Evelyn with an expression she had not seen from him before, something close to genuine gratitude. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "We handled it together," Evelyn corrected gently. He nodded slowly, studying her face in the soft moonlight. "I did not expect, when I handed you that list at the altar, that I would one day find myself grateful for a wife who refuses to follow it." Evelyn laughed softly. "I did warn you, Your Grace." "You did," he admitted, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his usual composure. "I am beginning to think warnings from you should be taken far more seriously than I initially assumed." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the noise of the ball fading gently behind them, and Evelyn felt, for the first time since her wedding, something that almost resembled hope. Whatever walls the Duke had built around himself over the years were not disappearing entirely, not yet, but they were shifting, slowly and carefully, in ways she had not expected to witness so soon. Rule 3. forbidding her involvement in matters concerning the estate, lay quietly broken behind them, forgotten entirely in the warmth of an unexpected partnership neither of them had planned to find. The trip to the northern tenant lands had been planned for weeks, a routine visit the Duke made twice a year to review the condition of the farms and speak directly with the families who worked them. Evelyn had asked to join him, half expecting refusal, but he had simply nodded, telling her to dress warmly, as the northern roads were often unpredictable this time of year. They set out early in the morning, the carriage rolling steadily along winding country roads, lined with tall oak trees just beginning to lose their leaves. Evelyn watched the countryside pass by, enjoying the rare, comfortable silence between them, occasionally broken by the Duke pointing out landmarks or sharing small details about the tenants they would soon visit. "That is the Miller farm," he said, gesturing toward a distant cottage surrounded by golden fields. "Old Henry Miller has worked that land for over 30 years. His daughter, Charlotte, recently married a young man from the village and moved into the cottage beside it." Evelyn smiled, surprised by how much detail he carried in his memory, about people most nobles would never bother to learn by name. "You know a great deal about your tenants." "My grandfather taught me their names before he ever taught me etiquette," the Duke said quietly. He believed a man who did not know the people responsible for his wealth had no right to that wealth at all. "Your father did not share that belief?" Evelyn asked carefully, aware she was treading close to forbidden territory. The Duke's expression tightened slightly, though he did not shut the conversation down entirely as she expected. "My father believed people existed to serve a purpose, nothing more. Tenants provided income, wives provided heirs. Affection was, in his mind, an unnecessary complication in an otherwise efficient arrangement." Evelyn's chest tightened at the quiet bitterness in his voice. "That sounds like a very lonely way to live." "It was," he admitted softly, before quickly changing the subject, as though surprised by his own honesty. The weather shifted quickly as they approached the final farm on their journey, dark clouds rolling in with unexpected speed, and within the hour, rain began falling in heavy sheets across the muddy roads. The carriage driver, unable to safely continue in the worsening storm, guided them toward a small stone cottage near the edge of the Ashford lands, one used occasionally by workers during harvest season, but currently empty. They hurried inside as the storm intensified, the Duke quickly starting a fire in the small hearth, while Evelyn searched the cottage for dry blankets. Outside, thunder rolled across the darkening sky, rain hammering steadily against the windows, trapping them together in the small, warm space, for what was clearly going to be several hours at minimum. "It seems we are stranded," the Duke said, settling onto the wooden bench near the fire, his usual composed demeanor slightly softened by the unexpected circumstances. "It seems so," Evelyn agreed, sitting carefully beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire, but maintaining a respectful distance between them. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm outside, until Evelyn finally spoke, her curiosity once again overpowering her caution. "Tell me about her. Your mother." The Duke's shoulders tensed slightly, though he did not refuse the question this time. "She loved gardens," he said quietly. "She used to take me walking through the grounds every morning, teaching me the names of flowers most children never bothered to learn. She had a way of making even the most ordinary moments feel important." "She sounds wonderful," Evelyn said softly. "She was," he agreed, his voice thick with something Evelyn recognized immediately as grief that had never truly been allowed to heal. "After she died, my father closed the gardens along with the east wing. He said flowers served no practical purpose." Evelyn reached out slowly, placing her hand gently over his, an instinctive gesture of comfort rather than calculation. He glanced down at their joined hands, surprise flickering across his face, though he did not pull away. "I am sorry you were not allowed to grieve properly," she said quietly. "A child should never be taught that love is something to be ashamed of." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, before finally speaking again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I have spent most of my life believing affection only leads to pain. My father made certain of that lesson, repeating it constantly after my mother passed. I built the rules I gave you at our wedding, believing they would protect us both from exactly that kind of pain." "And now?" Evelyn asked, echoing the question she had asked him once before in the nursery. He turned to look at her fully, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. Now I find myself wondering if perhaps my father was wrong about everything he taught me. Evelyn's heart pounded steadily as she held his gaze, the storm outside seeming to fade into the background entirely. I was terrified of this marriage, she admitted quietly. Not because of who you were, but because I feared becoming invisible, the way so many women become invisible in marriages, built purely on duty, rather than genuine connection. You are many things, Evelyn, he said softly, but invisible has never once been among them. She smiled at that, feeling warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire beside them. I feared marrying a man who would never truly see me. Instead, I find myself slowly discovering a man who is only just beginning to see himself. He studied her for a long moment, something vulnerable and open crossing his features, a version of himself she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to witness. I do not know how to be the husband you deserve, he admitted quietly. I was never taught. Then we will learn together, Evelyn said simply. There is no rule requiring either of us to already know the answers. He laughed softly at that, a genuine, warm sound that Evelyn realized she wanted to hear again and again. You continue to break every rule I have ever known, Evelyn Hart. Ashford, she corrected gently, smiling. I believe that is my name now, Your Grace. Alexander, he said quietly. Please, just Alexander. The rain continued outside, but inside the small cottage, something had shifted between them entirely. A wall carefully built over years of pain, beginning, finally, to crumble. They talked long into the evening, sharing pieces of themselves neither had intended to reveal so openly, the fire slowly burning lower as the storm gradually eased outside. By the time the carriage driver returned to announce the roads were finally passable again, Evelyn realized something important had changed between them, something far more significant than simply broken rules written on a piece of paper. She had come to this marriage expecting duty and distance. She was beginning, instead, to discover something that felt remarkably, unexpectedly, like the beginning of real affection. As they rode back toward Ravensworth Hall in comfortable silence, Evelyn glanced toward Alexander, watching him stare thoughtfully out the window, and felt something warm settle quietly into place inside her chest. Whatever walls remained standing between them, she suspected, would not remain standing much longer. Word arrived that Lady Constance Whitfield had returned to the city, and with her arrival came a wave of quiet gossip that rippled through every drawing room within reach of Ravensworth Hall. Evelyn heard the whispers first from Margaret, who mentioned the name carefully, watching Evelyn's reaction as though testing how much she already knew. Lady Constance was once expected to marry His Grace, Margaret admitted quietly, arranging fresh flowers in the sitting room. Before his father arranged your marriage instead. Some say her family never quite forgave the broken understanding between them. Evelyn absorbed this information carefully, saying little, though her mind turned the details over repeatedly throughout the day. Alexander had never mentioned Lady Constance, not once, in all their long conversations since the storm at the cottage had softened the distance between them. She wondered, with a small, uncomfortable twist in her chest, whether his silence meant the memory held little significance, or whether it meant precisely the opposite. She did not have to wonder for long. Lady Constance arrived at Ravensworth Hall 3 days later, uninvited, claiming a sudden desire to renew old acquaintances, now that she had returned from an extended stay abroad. She swept into the sitting room with practiced elegance, her golden curls perfectly arranged, her smile warm in a way that did not quite reach her calculating eyes. Alexander, she said warmly, using his given name with a familiarity that made Evelyn's spine straighten instinctively. It has been far too long. Constance, Alexander replied evenly, his expression carefully neutral, though Evelyn noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. I did not expect your visit. I simply could not resist seeing how you were faring, Constance said smoothly, her eyes finally shifting toward Evelyn with polite, if noticeably cool acknowledgement. And your new Duchess, of course. How lovely to finally meet you properly. Lady Constance, Evelyn said politely, offering a composed smile, despite the unease settling steadily in her stomach. The visit stretched uncomfortably through the afternoon, Constance skillfully steering conversation toward shared memories from years past, references to gatherings and friendships Evelyn had no part of. subtle reminders scattered throughout every sentence that she and Alexander shared history stretching back long before Evelyn had ever entered his life. Alexander responded politely but distantly, offering little encouragement to the conversation, though Evelyn noticed he did not ask Constance to leave either. Once Constance finally departed, promising to return soon for a proper visit, Evelyn found herself unusually quiet, her earlier confidence shaken by the encounter. Alexander noticed immediately. "You are troubled," he observed, watching her carefully across the sitting room. "I am simply tired," Evelyn said, though the lie sat poorly on her tongue. "Evelyn," he said gently, using her name in the soft tone that had become familiar between them since the storm. "Tell me what troubles you." She hesitated, then decided honesty served her better than pretense. "Lady Constance clearly holds affection for you still. I find myself wondering how much of that affection was once returned, and whether it remains returned even now." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "Constance and I were expected to marry, many years ago, before my father arranged things differently. After a business dispute between our families ended that expectation entirely. I will not pretend there was never fondness between us, but it was fondness born from familiarity, not from the kind of connection I have only recently begun to understand exists between people who truly choose each other." "And now?" Evelyn asked quietly, echoing words that had become something of a habit between them. "Now," he said, stepping closer, his gray eyes steady and sincere, "I find myself far more troubled by the thought of losing your good opinion than I have ever been troubled by Constance's return." Evelyn's heart softened slightly at his words, though the unease Constance had stirred did not fully disappear. Over the following days, Constance visited Ravensworth Hall with increasing frequency, always finding reasons to seek Alexander's company, always finding subtle ways to remind Evelyn of a history she could never fully compete with. Evelyn watched, growing increasingly frustrated, though she refused to lower herself to open confrontation, choosing instead quiet dignity over public jealousy. Matters came to a head during a garden party hosted by Lady Pemberton, where Constance approached Evelyn directly, her tone sweetly poisonous beneath its polished surface. "You must find it difficult," Constance said, watching Evelyn with false sympathy, "knowing you will always be the wife chosen for practical reasons, while women like myself understand exactly what once could have been between Alexander and me, had circumstances allowed it." Evelyn met her gaze steadily, refusing to allow the comment to wound her publicly. "Circumstances did not allow it, Lady Constance. Perhaps it is time to accept that fact gracefully, rather than seeking comfort in imagining alternatives that were never truly within your reach." Constance's polished smile faltered slightly, clearly unaccustomed to such direct resistance. She excused herself shortly afterward, her earlier confidence considerably diminished, though Evelyn suspected this would not be the final attempt to unsettle her position. Later that evening, Alexander found Evelyn standing quietly near the gardens, her expression thoughtful as she watched the sunset fade slowly behind the distant hills. "I heard about your conversation with Constance," he said carefully, coming to stand beside her. "Word travels quickly in this house," Evelyn replied, with a small, tired smile. "You handled it with far more grace than she deserved," he said quietly. "I should have addressed her visits more directly from the beginning. I did not realize how much discomfort her presence was causing you." Evelyn turned to face him fully, choosing her words carefully. "I do not fear Lady Constance taking your affection from me, Alexander. I fear only that you might one day regret choosing a marriage built from duty over a connection you once believed could have been built from choice." "Evelyn," he said softly, reaching out to gently take her hand, "I chose duty once, unwillingly, believing love was a luxury unavailable to men like myself. But every day since that storm at the cottage, I find myself choosing you, not from duty, but because I genuinely wish to. That is a choice Constance never once offered me the freedom to make." Evelyn's breath caught at the sincerity in his voice, warmth spreading steadily through her chest, despite the lingering unease Constance's visits had stirred. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "it is time Lady Constance understood that clearly, without room for further confusion." Alexander smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached fully into his gray eyes. "I believe that can be arranged." True to his word, Alexander made his position unmistakably clear during Constance's next visit, gently but firmly explaining that her continued attempts to revisit old expectations were unwelcome, and that his loyalty and affection belonged entirely to his wife. Constance left Ravensworth Hall shortly afterward, her visits ceasing entirely in the weeks that followed, the quiet threat she had represented finally, fully extinguished. Evelyn watched Alexander afterward with quiet admiration, recognizing the effort such directness must have cost a man raised to avoid emotional confrontation entirely. Whatever walls remained standing between them continued crumbling steadily, rule by rule, moment by moment, drawing them closer together than either had believed possible on the cold morning of their wedding. Autumn settled fully over Ravensworth Hall, painting the gardens in shades of deep gold and burnt orange, and with it came a quiet steadiness Evelyn had not expected to find in her marriage so soon. Mornings no longer began with cold silence across the breakfast table, but with genuine conversation, small shared jokes, and, more often than not, Alexander seeking her company before she ever had the chance to seek his. Yet not everyone within the household welcomed the change so warmly. Edmund Grey, the estate's longtime steward, had served the Ashford family since Alexander's father ruled the house, and he had grown accustomed to a certain rigid order that Evelyn's presence steadily continued to disrupt. He watched her now with thinly veiled disapproval whenever she involved herself in estate matters, his loyalty clearly rooted in old ways that resisted change. "The tenants respect firmness, Your Grace," Edmund said one afternoon, addressing Alexander directly, while Evelyn sat quietly nearby, reviewing ledgers she had taken increasing interest in managing. "Kindness, while admirable, can too easily be mistaken for weakness." "The tenants have never once mistaken kindness for weakness," Evelyn said calmly, before Alexander could respond. "They have simply never been offered the opportunity to experience it under this family's management before now." Edmund's expression tightened, though he said nothing further in the moment, excusing himself with stiff formality. Alexander watched him leave, then turned to Evelyn with a small, thoughtful frown. "He served my father loyally for many years," Alexander said. "Change does not come easily to men who have spent decades believing firmness and coldness were the same virtue." "Then perhaps it is time he learned otherwise," Evelyn replied gently. "As you have." Alexander smiled softly at that, reaching across the table to take her hand, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them in recent weeks. "I have learned a great deal from you, Evelyn, more than I ever expected possible when I handed you that list at our wedding." "Do you regret it?" Evelyn asked, curious despite herself. "Writing those rules, I mean." Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret believing, for so many years, that rules built from fear could ever protect me from genuine pain. They protected me from nothing, Evelyn. They simply delayed the inevitable moment when someone brave enough would refuse to accept them, forcing me to finally confront everything I had spent my entire life avoiding." Evelyn squeezed his hand gently, warmth blooming steadily in her chest at his honesty. Their growing closeness, however, did not go entirely unnoticed by the wider household, nor by Edmund, whose quiet resentment continued simmering beneath the surface of his dutiful service. Matters escalated further when Edmund, without informing Alexander directly, dismissed a young tenant family from their cottage over a minor and easily correctable rent discrepancy, insisting the action fell strictly within his authority as steward. Evelyn discovered the situation only after encountering the family, a mother and her 2 young children, standing helplessly outside their cottage with what few belongings they could carry. Furious, Evelyn immediately arranged for the family's temporary lodging within the estate's own guest quarters before seeking out Alexander directly, explaining the situation with barely restrained anger. "Edmund had no right to act without your knowledge," she said firmly. "A family now stands homeless over a discrepancy easily resolved through simple conversation, rather than cruelty disguised as discipline." Alexander's expression darkened considerably as he listened, clearly troubled by the news. "This will not happen again," he said firmly, before summoning Edmund immediately to address the matter directly. The confrontation that followed was tense, Edmund defending his actions as necessary firmness, insisting kindness, too freely given only invited tenants to take advantage of their position. Alexander listened carefully, though his expression remained unyielding throughout Edmund's justification. "My father believed exactly as you do," Alexander said finally, his voice steady but firm. "And I spent years believing it alongside him, until I learned firmness and cruelty are not, in fact, the same virtue. You will restore the family's cottage immediately, Edmund, and you will apologize to them personally. Should such an action occur again, without my direct knowledge and approval, your service to this family will come to an end." Edmund's expression flickered with surprise, clearly unaccustomed to such direct correction from a duke he had once helped raise. He nodded stiffly, excusing himself to correct the situation as instructed, though the tension between himself and Evelyn remained noticeably unresolved in the weeks that followed. That evening, alone together in their private sitting room, Alexander turned to Evelyn with quiet admiration. "You saw a problem I did not even know existed, and corrected it before I ever had the chance." "I simply refused to walk past a family in need without helping," Evelyn said simply. "You would have done the same, had you known sooner." "Perhaps," Alexander admitted, "though I suspect, had you not shown me otherwise, I might have continued trusting Edmund's judgment without question, the same way my father always did." Evelyn smiled softly, settling comfortably beside him near the fire. "Then it seems marriage has proven useful for more than simply satisfying old family debts, Your Grace." Alexander laughed softly, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders, a gesture that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. "It seems, Evelyn Ashford, that marrying you has proven to be the single most valuable decision my family ever made, arranged or otherwise." Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder, feeling, for the first time since her wedding day, genuinely and completely at peace within the walls of Ravensworth Hall. Yet even as warmth settled steadily between them, she could not entirely ignore the quiet unease still lingering from Edmund's resentment, nor the small, nagging worry that old loyalties within this house might not surrender so easily to the changes she continued bringing steadily into their lives. The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, sealed with wax bearing a crest Evelyn did not immediately recognize. Alexander read it alone in his study, and when Evelyn found him afterward, his face had returned to the cold, guarded expression she had not seen since the earliest days of their marriage. "What has happened?" she asked carefully, sensing immediately that something had shifted. "Nothing that concerns you," Alexander said flatly, folding the letter quickly and placing it inside a locked drawer of his desk. Evelyn felt the old sting of that phrase, one she had believed long buried between them. "Everything concerning this house concerns me, Alexander. You taught me that lesson yourself, or have you forgotten so quickly?" He did not answer immediately, his jaw tight, his eyes distant in a way that unsettled her deeply. "It is a family matter," he said finally, his tone clipped, "one better handled privately." The distance between them, which had steadily narrowed over recent weeks, suddenly felt as wide as it had on their wedding night. Evelyn left the study without further argument, though her mind churned uneasily throughout the remainder of the day, replaying every possible explanation for his sudden withdrawal. Over the following days, Alexander grew increasingly distant, spending long hours locked away in his study, missing meals they had recently begun sharing together, avoiding conversations that had grown comfortable and warm between them. Evelyn watched the walls she believed had crumbled steadily rebuild themselves, brick by careful brick, and found herself growing increasingly frightened by how quickly old patterns could return. She finally confronted him one evening, refusing to accept his silence any longer. "You are pulling away from me," she said directly, standing firmly in the doorway of his study. "I do not know what that letter contained, but I refuse to watch you disappear behind old walls without understanding why." Alexander looked up from his desk, exhaustion evident across his features. "The letter came from my father's former solicitor," he said finally, his voice strained. "It concerns evidence, suggesting my father's death was not entirely the accident it was believed to be at the time." Evelyn's breath caught sharply. "Alexander, there is more," he continued, his voice hardening slightly. "The solicitor suggests my mother's death, years earlier, may not have been natural either, that my father, in his final years, grew paranoid, convinced someone within this household had harmed her deliberately." Evelyn stepped closer slowly, processing the weight of what he had just revealed. "Do you believe this is true?" "I do not know what to believe," Alexander admitted, his composure finally cracking beneath the strain he had clearly been carrying alone. I have spent my entire life believing my mother's death was simply cruel misfortune. The possibility that it was something far darker, something perhaps connected to this very house, is not something I know how to carry. Then let me help you carry it, Evelyn said softly, moving to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands gently in hers. You do not have to face this alone, Alexander. Not anymore. He looked at her then, something raw and vulnerable breaking fully across his expression. I pulled away because I did not wish for you to witness me falling apart. My father taught me that weakness invited danger, that vulnerability was something to hide rather than share. Your father was wrong, Evelyn said firmly. About nearly everything, it seems. Vulnerability shared with someone who loves you is not weakness, Alexander. It is the very foundation upon which genuine strength is built. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly within hers, before finally allowing himself, fully and completely, to break down the composure he had maintained his entire adult life. Evelyn held him gently, as years of buried grief finally found release. The weight of secrets and suspicion he had carried silently, now shared openly, for the very first time, with someone who refused to let him carry it alone. We will discover the truth together, Evelyn said quietly, once his breathing had steadied. Whatever happened to your mother, whatever your father believed in his final years, you do not have to face it isolated behind locked doors and old rules. Alexander nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, a rare and genuine vulnerability, replacing the cold composure Evelyn had once believed impossible to break. I am sorry, he said quietly, for pulling away, for forgetting, even briefly, everything you have taught me about facing difficulty, honestly, rather than hiding from it. You are forgiven, Evelyn said gently, though I expect you to remember this lesson far more permanently in the future, Your Grace. He laughed softly, despite the heaviness of the moment, pulling her gently into a careful embrace. I do not deserve you, Evelyn. Perhaps not, she teased gently, though warmth softened her words completely. But you have me regardless, and I do not intend to go anywhere, regardless of what difficult truths we may yet discover together. Over the following weeks, they investigated the solicitor's claims carefully together, reviewing old correspondence, speaking quietly with longtime servants, who remembered the final years of Alexander's father's life. The truth, when it finally emerged, proved neither as simple nor as dark as either had feared, revealing instead a tragic combination of grief, guilt, and paranoia that had slowly consumed a broken man following the genuine accidental loss of his wife. Yet even as the darkest fears were gradually laid to rest, the experience of facing crisis together, rather than separately, had changed something fundamental between Alexander and Evelyn, cementing a trust neither had believed themselves capable of building so completely. Whatever walls remained standing between them by the end of that difficult season had crumbled almost entirely, replaced instead by a partnership built on honesty, vulnerability, and a love neither had expected to find within a marriage that began as nothing more than a practical arrangement. Winter arrived slowly at Ravensworth Hall, dusting the gardens with a thin layer of frost each morning, and with it came a quiet reflection Alexander had not expected to experience so deeply. The truth surrounding his parents' deaths, painful as it had been to uncover, had settled something restless within him, allowing him, for the first time in years, to grieve openly, rather than bury his sorrow behind rigid composure. Yet even as peace settled steadily over the household, Alexander found himself confronting a final, unspoken rule he had carried silently since childhood, one never written on the list he had given Evelyn at their wedding, yet one that had shaped every decision he had made since his mother's death. Do not fall in love. His father had never spoken the words directly, yet the lesson had been unmistakable throughout Alexander's entire upbringing, reinforced through years of careful emotional distance and cold, practical decision-making. He recognized now, sitting quietly in his study one evening while Evelyn read nearby, that this final rule had already been broken, thoroughly and irreversibly, weeks earlier. He simply had not yet found the courage to acknowledge it fully, even to himself. You are staring, Evelyn observed, glancing up from her book with a small, amused smile. I am thinking, Alexander replied honestly. About what? He considered his answer carefully before speaking. About how thoroughly you have dismantled every rule I once believed necessary for survival in this house. Evelyn set her book aside, studying him curiously. Which rule troubles you tonight? One I never wrote down, Alexander admitted quietly. Though I suspect you broke it long before I ever recognized what was happening. Evelyn's expression softened with understanding, though she remained quiet, allowing him space to continue at his own pace. My father taught me that love only creates vulnerability, and vulnerability only invites pain, Alexander continued. I believed him completely, for many years, convinced that protecting myself from love was the only way to protect myself from ever experiencing loss, as devastating as losing my mother. And now, Evelyn asked softly, the familiar question settling gently between them once again. Alexander rose from his chair, crossing the room slowly, to kneel beside where she sat, taking her hands gently in his own. Now I understand that avoiding love did not protect me from pain at all. It simply ensured I lived my entire life, without ever experiencing genuine joy either. You have taught me, Evelyn, more thoroughly than any rule my father ever attempted to instill, that love is not weakness. It is the very thing that makes vulnerability worth risking. Evelyn's breath caught softly, her eyes glistening with unexpected emotion at the sincerity in his voice. Alexander, I love you, he said simply, the words unguarded and complete, carrying none of the careful composure he had maintained throughout every difficult conversation since their wedding. Not out of duty, not out of arrangement, but because you walked into a house built entirely on fear, and refused, from your very first morning here, to accept its rules without question. You have shown me, patiently and persistently, exactly what I spent my entire life avoiding, and I find myself, for the first time, grateful beyond measure for every rule you have broken. Tears slipped freely down Evelyn's cheeks as she absorbed his words, warmth and joy spreading completely through her chest. I love you too, she said softly. I did not expect to. Not when I agreed to this marriage, not even after everything we have shared since. But somewhere between that first framed list and this very moment, I fell in love with you completely. Alexander Ashford. He smiled, genuine and unguarded, before leaning forward to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, then finally, softly, against her lips, a moment neither had planned yet, both had clearly been waiting for, since the storm had first begun softening the distance between them. I believe, Alexander said quietly, resting his forehead gently against hers, that this makes every single rule I ever wrote entirely obsolete. Evelyn laughed softly through her remaining tears. I believe you are correct, Your Grace. Alexander, he corrected gently, echoing words spoken many months earlier in that small stone cottage, during the storm, that had changed everything between them. Alexander, Evelyn repeated softly, smiling warmly against his lips. They remained together quietly by the fire long into the evening, the final rule Alexander had carried silently since childhood, now fully and completely broken, replaced instead by a love neither had believed possible when their marriage first began, as nothing more than a practical arrangement forged from debt and duty. Whatever fears had once shaped the cold, guarded man Evelyn had married on that distant wedding day had finally, fully surrendered to the persistent warmth and courage of the woman who had refused, from her very first morning at Ravensworth Hall, to accept anything less than genuine connection. Spring returned to Ravensworth Hall with the promise of new beginnings. The gardens Alexander's father had once ordered, abandoned, now steadily restored under Evelyn's careful direction. She had spent the winter months planning the restoration alongside the household staff, determined to bring life back into spaces that had remained frozen in grief for far too many years. Edmund Gray, the estate's longtime steward, watched the changes unfold with an expression that had softened considerably since the difficult confrontation over the dismissed tenant family months earlier. He approached Evelyn quietly one afternoon, while she directed the planting of new rose bushes near the east wing's previously neglected garden. Your Grace, he said formally, I owe you an apology. I have delayed too long in offering. Evelyn straightened, brushing soil from her hands, studying him, with genuine curiosity, rather than lingering resentment. Go on, Edmund. I served the late Duke faithfully for many years, Edmund said carefully, and I believed, quite firmly, that his methods represented the only correct way to manage this estate and this family. Watching you these past months, I have come to understand that firmness and coldness were never truly the same virtue, no matter how thoroughly I once believed otherwise. Evelyn's expression softened considerably at his sincerity. Thank you, Edmund. I know change does not come easily to men who have spent decades believing differently. No, Edmund agreed quietly. It does not. But I have watched His Grace these past months, watched him laugh more freely, watched him address the tenants directly rather than through cold correspondence, and I recognize now that whatever change you have brought to this house has made it better, not weaker, as I once feared. Their conversation marked a quiet but meaningful shift within the household, old resentments finally giving way to genuine respect. Yet even as internal harmony settled steadily over Ravensworth Hall, wider society continued whispering about the unconventional marriage between the once notoriously cold Duke and the wife who had so publicly refused to fade quietly into his shadow. Matters came to a gentle head during the annual spring gathering hosted by the Ashford family itself, the first such event held at Ravensworth Hall since Alexander's mother had passed away many years earlier. Evelyn had spent weeks preparing the event carefully, determined to reintroduce warmth and genuine hospitality into a house long associated with cold formality. As guests gathered throughout the newly restored gardens, admiring the careful restoration Evelyn had overseen, quiet murmurs continued circulating about the unusual openness now displayed between the Duke and his wife. Alexander, sensing the lingering curiosity among his guests, made an unexpected decision partway through the evening, requesting everyone's brief attention before addressing the gathered crowd directly. Many of you have known my family for generations, he began, his voice steady and clear across the quiet garden. You knew my father, and you knew the manner in which he chose to run this household and this estate. I spent many years believing his methods represented strength, that coldness and firmness were virtues worth preserving at any cost. He paused, glancing toward Evelyn, who watched him with quiet surprise, uncertain where this unexpected address was heading. I was wrong, Alexander continued simply. My wife walked into this house on our wedding day and refused, from her very first morning here, to accept the fear and distance I had built my entire life around. She broke every rule I gave her, not out of disrespect, but because she understood something I had forgotten entirely, that a house built on fear can never truly be called a home. Evelyn's eyes filled with unexpected tears as he continued speaking, the assembled guests falling into respectful, attentive silence. I love my wife, Alexander said simply, his voice carrying easily across the quiet garden. Not out of duty, not out of arrangement, but because she taught me, patiently and persistently, exactly what my father spent years teaching me to fear. I am grateful, more than words can properly express, for every single rule she has broken since the day I foolishly handed her that list at our altar. The garden erupted into warm applause, several guests visibly moved by the unexpected sincerity of his address. Evelyn crossed the distance between them quickly, embracing him despite the audience of curious onlookers, her earlier tears now falling freely with genuine joy rather than lingering sorrow. Later that evening, once the guests had finally departed and the household had settled quietly for the night, Alexander led Evelyn upstairs toward her private chambers, toward the small silver frame still hanging exactly where she had placed it on their very first morning together. I believe, he said softly, carefully removing the frame from the wall, that this has served its purpose thoroughly enough. Evelyn watched, her heart full, as he gently opened the frame and removed the original list of rules, the paper now worn soft from months of quiet reflection. He studied the words carefully one final time before folding the paper completely and placing it into the fireplace, watching quietly as flames consumed the final remnants of the fear that had once governed their entire marriage. Every rule is broken, Evelyn said softly, watching the paper disappear into ash. Every single one, Alexander agreed, pulling her gently into his arms. And I have never once been more grateful for anything in my entire life. A full year had passed since Evelyn Hart had stood nervously at the altar of a small stone chapel, accepting a folded list of rules from a man she barely knew. Ravensworth Hall looked entirely different now, its gardens flourishing under careful attention, its corridors filled with warmth and easy conversation, rather than cold, careful silence. The staff moved through their duties with genuine cheerfulness rather than quiet caution, and even Edmund Gray, once so resistant to change, had grown into one of the household's most devoted supporters of Evelyn's continued influence. Alexander found her early one morning in the restored East Wing gardens, kneeling carefully among the rose bushes his mother had once tended so lovingly many years before. Sunlight filtered gently through the surrounding trees, illuminating the garden in soft golden light, a peaceful contrast to the storm that had first brought them together within these very walls. "Happy anniversary," he said softly, settling onto the bench beside her. Evelyn smiled, brushing soil gently from her hands before joining him. "Has it truly been a full year already?" "It has," Alexander confirmed, producing a small folded paper from within his coat, offering it to her with a gentle, knowing smile. "I believe tradition suggests I owe you another list, though I suspect this one will look considerably different from the first." Evelyn laughed softly, taking the paper curiously and unfolding it carefully. Instead of rigid rules, written in cold, formal handwriting, she found something entirely different. A list, written together weeks earlier, during quiet evenings, spent discussing the kind of life they wished to build together moving forward. Promise 1. Always speak honestly, even when honesty proves difficult. Promise 2. Never allow fear to build walls where love should stand instead. Promise 3. Welcome tenants, family, and strangers alike, with warmth rather than cold formality. Promise 4. Remember, always, that vulnerability shared honestly is never weakness. Promise 5. Break every wall we build, together, for as long as we both shall live. Evelyn's eyes filled with happy tears as she read through the promises carefully, recognizing her own words woven carefully alongside his throughout the list. "This is beautiful, Alexander." "I thought it fitting," Alexander said softly, "that our first anniversary should mark the creation of promises rather than rules. Promises we choose freely, rather than restrictions born from fear." Evelyn leaned forward, kissing him softly, warmth and gratitude spreading completely through her chest. "I believe I shall frame this one as well," she said with a gentle laugh, "though I suspect I shall have no need to break a single promise contained within it." "No," Alexander agreed, smiling warmly as he wrapped his arms gently around her. "I do not believe you shall need to break these at all." They sat together quietly in the restored garden, sunlight warming their shoulders, the quiet sounds of the household drifting peacefully from the house beyond. Margaret appeared briefly at the garden's edge, smiling warmly at the sight before discreetly withdrawing, leaving the Duke and Duchess alone to enjoy their quiet celebration undisturbed. Later that evening, as they prepared the framed promises for display, alongside the small silver frame that had once held the original list of rules, now sitting empty upon Evelyn's wall, as a quiet reminder of how far their marriage had traveled, Alexander paused thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The debts, the arrangement, everything that brought us together in the first place?" Evelyn considered the question seriously before answering, her expression thoughtful and warm. "I regret the circumstances that led my family into such difficult debt," she admitted honestly. "But I could never regret the marriage those circumstances ultimately created. You were not the man I expected to marry, Alexander, but you have become, entirely and completely, the man I am grateful to spend my life beside." Alexander smiled, pulling her gently closer as they finished arranging the new frame together upon the wall. "I believe my mother would have liked you very much," he said softly, glancing toward the restored garden visible through the window, the roses she had once tended now flourishing once again beneath careful attention. "I believe I would have liked her very much as well," Evelyn replied gently, resting her head against his shoulder as the evening settled peacefully around them. Outside, the restored gardens continued flourishing beneath the gentle spring sunlight, a quiet testament to everything that had changed within Ravensworth Hall since the cold morning Evelyn Hart had first arrived, as a stranger bound by duty rather than choice. The framed rules that had once represented fear and distance now sat empty upon the wall, replaced entirely by promises built from genuine love, patience, and the quiet courage of a woman who had refused, from her very first morning in that house, to accept anything less than a marriage built on honesty rather than mere obligation. Their story, which had begun with a folded list of rules handed coldly across an altar, had transformed steadily into something neither had believed themselves capable of building. A partnership rooted deeply in trust, vulnerability, and love, freely chosen rather than dutifully accepted. And as the sun set gently over the gardens of Ravensworth Hall that evening, marking the close of their very first year together, both Alexander and Evelyn understood clearly that whatever challenges still awaited them in the years ahead, they would face them exactly as they had learned to face everything since that very first morning, together, honestly, and without fear.